It's been 1 month since President Jae Myung took office. It's still early days, but we zoom in on the course of his foreign affairs and security policies, which he has defined as pragmatic diplomacy. For this, we have our Oh Seung in the studio. Welcome back, Seung.
Hi, Tammy. It's great to be back.
So, Seung, it's been 1 month. How would you summarize the first month of his so-called pragmatic diplomacy?
Well, Tammy, I think it's been quite an interesting mix of both continuity and change from the previous Yoon administration. In being pragmatic, the Lee government has clearly kept Seoul's global diplomacy intact at his first multilateral summit at the G7. Now, holding at least 10 individual summits with world leaders, his focus was to reinforce South Korea's position in the international community as a vibrant democratic partner after 6 months of a leadership vacuum following former President Yoon Suk-yeol's martial law crisis last year. Now, there's continuity, too, in South Korea's strategic relationships. His first phone calls with world leaders were made in the order of the US, Japan, and then China. Now, that's really interesting as it mirrors the previous Yoon administration's priorities, emphasizing the South Korea-US alliance, as well as a future-oriented partnership with Tokyo. That's been quite surprising given how past progressive leaders have shown more affinity towards China than Japan, emphasizing historical disputes with the latter. Now, where there's been some recalibration is when it comes to values. Now, the former Yoon administration endorsed liberal democratic values as the basis for cooperation. But the new Lee Jae-myung administration has indicated that it will focus on what serves Korean interests, not necessarily values. So that includes diversifying its cooperation and working with countries like China and Russia, avoiding this so-called bloc-based mentality. On North Korea, Lee's strategy is clearly geared towards lowering tensions. Even in the first month of his presidency, he decided to withhold psychological warfare tactics such as loudspeaker broadcasts along the border, and he's initiated crackdowns on South Korean groups, sending anti-North Korea regime flyers over the border. So all of this is a very sharp contrast to the tit-for-tat escalation under the previous administration.
Indeed, and his top policymakers will initiate this pragmatic diplomacy. Let's turn to his ministerial nominees for key defense, diplomatic, and security positions. What does his selection of ministers really indicate?
Right, so President Lee Jae-myung's picks for the Ministers of Foreign Affairs, Unification and Defense, it really represents a decisive pivot, I would say, towards the institutional experience and also peace rather than deterrence towards North Korea. Now, Foreign Minister nominee Cho Yeon is a career diplomat with decades of experience in multilateral diplomacy. He's emphasized the importance of diversifying Korea's diplomatic interests, and speaking during an interview, Cho said that it was time to move beyond what he called the stereotype that diplomacy for South Korea begins and ends with the United States. But at the same time, he's acknowledged America's centrality in building peace with North Korea, saying that achieving the US-North Korea dialogue, or summit rather, and establishing peace on the Korean Peninsula is one of the administration's top priorities. Now, the nominee for Unification Minister Chung Dong-young is also no stranger to the inter-Korean agenda. He's held the same position during the previous Nomuyon administration, and he played a very central role in organizing the 2007 Inter-Korean Summit. And he said that he supports the possible US-North Korea talks, noting that they would help ease tensions on the Korean Peninsula and contribute to peace and stability. He's also made headlines by suggesting that the very name Ministry of Unification may be outdated and that the ministry should shift its emphasis away from the symbolic unification rhetoric and instead focus on concrete goals like humanitarian cooperation and sustainable coexistence between the South and North. Now, a particularly significant appointment is Ang Kyu-baek as Defense Minister. Now, he would be the first civilian to hold the post in more than 6 decades. His nomination represents the democratic oversight of the military, particularly after the martial law crisis last year, as well as reform to better support armed forces amid sharp technological and geopolitical changes. He's also emphasized the need for a peaceful overture between the South and North to create the mood for military tensions to be eased.
Well, Seong, last but not least, I have to ask, is the South Korea-U.S. summit still expected in late July? If so, what are the stakes?
Well, I believe so, Tammy. So officials from both governments, they've confirmed this week that a summit in Washington is being arranged, and that's most likely for the week of July 21st. And Secretary of State Marco Rubio is, in fact, widely expected, not confirmed though, by many, to stop by in Seoul earlier in July to finalize the grounds for this possible summit. And, well, the three issues that the two leaders are expected to discuss are, first of all, America's tariffs on South Korea's foremost industrial goods, especially with Washington ending its grace period next Wednesday. Also, defense spending, as the United States calls on allies to pay more towards their own security and even cover areas outside their traditional cost-sharing agreements, such as the deployment of U.S. tactical assets. Another issue could possibly be, of course, North Korea, as President Lee moves to lower tensions while President Trump signals interest in resuming his dialogue with the North Korean leader. Now, if Lee and Trump were, they were both expected to meet at the G7 summit in Canada last month, but that meeting didn't take place as the US leader left early amid the Israel-Iran conflict. So their upcoming summits, that's going to be a major test of how the Lee administration balances alliance management with South Korea's national interest.
So the first high-stakes meeting for E's pragmatic diplomacy. Let's see what happens later this month. Seong, thanks so much for coming in today.
Thanks very much for having me, Tammy.